Good afternoon and welcome to Sabbath Afternoons on ASI Media Tobago. If this is your first time joining us, well, I must ask what took you so long? But seriously, we're happy that you joined us this afternoon and trust that this will not be the last. To our regulars, we thank you for making this your worship stream. And today we continue our conversation on issues surrounding COVID-19. And we promise that this afternoon will be very engaging as well. And some of you are probably thinking, COVID again, you're tired of it, I know. But it is our reality. And we need to continue to educate ourselves and inform us. That's the responsible thing to do. So I am Natalie Seeley Richardson, and I am your moderator for this afternoon. And we have a very interesting panel who you will be introduced to you in a short while. So at this time, I ask you to like, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and of course, share the news about ASI Media Tobago so someone can tune in even at this very moment and be blessed by what we have in store. I would also like to share some important news about our Wednesday evening services. Have you been blessed? I am sure you have been by those services. And just to engage you, our viewers, a little more, we are asking you to send in your questions you may have about a particular text or some passage in the Bible that may not be so clear to you and you would like some clarity. Our team is able and ready to assist in that area. So what I'm asking you to do is to email or WhatsApp those questions to the team, and our email address is asitobago@gmail.com. Quite easy, asitobago@gmail.com, and our WhatsApp number 767-0020. And if you don't hear your particular question being dealt with on that Wednesday, stay tuned, because week after week the team will be going through the questions as they come in and help you get some understanding. And of course, we would only be able to do that with the guide of the Holy Spirit. At this time, I invite us to bow our heads as we get ready for prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this afternoon. We thank you for all the viewers who are joining us at this time. We thank you for their support. We thank you that even as they help spread this gospel, Lord, more and more people will be blessed. We pray for those who will be on our program. May the words and information they are about to share provide clarity to those who may need it. Help us to continue to develop ourselves as your people, as your children, and have understanding. And may you just continue to bless what we do here at ASI Media so that your work, your gospel can be spread throughout all this world so that your soon coming can even be closer. Thank you, Lord, for hearing our prayer. Amen. So we continue this afternoon. And I know some of you may have seen the flyer and you saw a topic, the vaccination dilemma. What work has to do with it? And I know you've been hearing a lot in the news recently, and people are getting a bit edgy, employers versus employees. What's really going on? So stay tuned as we have that discussion in a short while. Now, for the last 2 weeks, we have been dealing with the church's official position on the COVID-19 vaccination. And if you missed the last 2 weeks, I ask you to go back and look at those 2 programs. I think it's very critical, a lot of information for us to understand as a Seventh-day Adventist. But I don't want you to go and look at it now. I want you to stay live right here with me as we go through this afternoon. And on screen, and I will read as you see it on screen, it is the official position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we dealt with this, but I want to remind us what it is. So as it's up on the screen, I will read in your hearing and you can follow along. And you can find this anywhere on the internet, any on our official SDA websites. Look at General Conference's website and you'll find it. So I read, the Seventh-day Adventist Church places strong emphasis on health and well-being. The Adventist health emphasis is based on biblical revelation, the inspired writing of E.G. White, co-founder of the church, and on peer-reviewed scientific literature. As such, we encourage responsible immunization vaccination. And this is the World Church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church speaking here, and have no religious or faith-based reason not to encourage our adherents to responsibly participate in protective and preventative immunization programs. We value the health and safety of the population, which includes the maintenance of herd immunity. We are not the conscience of the individual church member and recognize individual choices. These are exercised by the individual. The choice not to be immunized is not and should not be seen as the dogma nor the doctrine of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. End quote. So I trust we got that, right? So it's your personal position, and I'm encouraging some of our members to please do not represent your personal opinion as the church's position. We need to be our brother's keeper, yes. We need to be responsible for each other and to each other. It was also clarified last 2 weeks when we had the representative from the General Conference speaking that this COVID-19 vaccine is not and cannot be the mark of the beast. And if you are interested to hear more again and you missed these 2 presentations over the last 2 weeks, feel free to go back. And as I said, not right now, you're keeping me company here on this live, but after, when you have more time during the week, go back, look at those 2 Sabbath afternoon programs where you would get some more clarity to the position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, right? So again, it's up to you. You make that informed decision. Your responsibility is to do your research, have a clear conscience, and make your decision based on that. Don't be angry with your brother or sister who may choose something differently. But let us be responsible and not make our personal opinions become that of the church. And just to share with you a little something that happened to my husband this week. A very prominent person in Tobago met him, and that person's approach to him was like, I took my vaccine, but I know all your Adventists not in that. He was quite surprised. He had to tell her, oh no, I have my 2 jabs, I'm good. So Adventists are taking the vaccine as well. So again, it's a personal choice, and the World Church is saying, the World Church, as in the Seventh-day Adventist churches, has a position on vaccination that wasn't developed just for COVID, but we are vaccinated from babies, right? You make your choice. That's on you. So my brothers and sisters or viewers out there, even those who are joining us for the very first time, I welcome you, and we will be discussing the vaccine dilemma, what work has to do with it. And I am your moderator, Natalie Seeley Richardson. And when we come back after hearing some beautiful music, I will introduce you to, if not all of our panelists, at least one of them. So stay tuned.
Gentle hands holding on to me, gentle hands guiding me so carefully, though they lead me down through paths I don't always understand. I will never fear, for I'm in gentle hands. Like a little child, sometimes it's hard to see just which way I need to go and what is best for me. But I have a loving Father who always understands, and it's a consolation to know that I'm in gentle hands. I turn to my Savior, He's always to be found. And He tells me not to worry, for I am in His care. I can turn to Jesus, His loving hands are always there. Gentle hands holding on to me, gentle hands guiding me so carefully. Though they lead me down through paths I don't always understand, I will never fear, for I'm in gentle hands. In the darkness of the midnight, when it's so hard to see, well, I don't have to worry, for I know He's holding me and guiding me. Gentle hands holding on to me, gentle hands guiding me so carefully. Though they lead me down through paths I don't always understand, I will never fear, for I'm in gentle hands. Gentle hands holding on to me, gentle hands guiding me so carefully. Though they lead me down through paths I don't always understand, I will never fear, for I'm in gentle hands. I will never fear, for I'm in gentle hands. You don't have to fear when you're in gentle
Welcome back, viewers, and if you are now joining us, we will continue our COVID-19 discussion, and we will be presenting the topic, the vaccination dilemma, what the workplace has to do with it. All right, so if you are now joining us, as I said, I ask you to stay tuned. And I know some of you are probably very exhausted about these discussions. It's everywhere, but it's really critical that we have clarity, we have information, correct information, I may add, so that we can all make informed decisions, whether you choose to vaccinate or not, whatever choice you may make. So this afternoon, one of our panelists is joining us virtually, and she's no stranger to us here in Tobago, the region, and may I add, even the world. She is Dr. Faith B. Israel, and she's a social scientist whose focus is on health education, program development, and implementation. She's quite active in an NGO she's founder of, and we know her as a politician, but she's sitting here this afternoon with me virtually as a social scientist, and she's going to present to us living with COVID-19, what it means, and we will have that discussion with her. You would have an opportunity to ask questions later on, so whatever may come to mind based on her presentation, take a note of it, and you can send in those questions via WhatsApp to 767-0200 or our email address asitobago@gmail.com. And before Dr. Faith joins me, I want to look at some information. We're talking about living with COVID-19. It's a pandemic, yes. We've been at it for more than a year. Let's look at some statistics. So this was presented via the Tobago House of Assembly this morning that deals with yesterday's statistics. You know that they report usually 10 a.m. the following morning based on the statistics they would have gathered and acquired the afternoon before. So this was released this morning, Saturday, 24th of July, 2021. And just to share it with you in case you may have missed it, new cases reported in the last 24 hours, 36. Now, some of you may say, especially those of you living outside of Tobago, oh, that's a little bit. It's not a little bit for a population of just about 60,000. And we are supposed to be following 3 Ws and doing what we have to do. New cases, 36. Active cases, 324. Patients in state isolation, 32. Patients in home isolation, 288. Patients in ICU, 4. Patients at step-down facilities on the island, 0. Discharges, 8, and I'm very thankful people got to go home. Sadly, though, we had 2 new deaths. And it's always very painstaking, you know, when you have to hear these statistics, and many countries report like this, and you hear how many persons are dying. Total positive cases, that's from March 2020 to present, as reported by the Communications Unit of the Tobago House of Assembly, 1,280. Total recovered patients, 921. And total deaths, 35. Those taking the first dose of vaccinations, 12,079. And I must say, I may lose some friends for those who are real anti-vaxxers. I am one of those in the first dose, so my number is somewhere in that 12,000 plus. And then those who are fully vaccinated, 9,348. Viewers, I made an error with our WhatsApp number, so let's get that correction pretty soon. So hold on that. I'm waiting to get the right number for WhatsApp because I know you have your questions. All right, so let's remember to be safe. It's very important. And let's continue to really look out for each other. Sometimes we may let our guard down, even with our own families. But let's remind each other, you know, you're coming to look for me, wear your mask. Pull it up over your nose. I can hear you through the mask. I know plenty of people just speak a little louder in some cases, but I know even when you go to the supermarkets or you go in public places that are allowed to do business, you see people wearing their mask beneath their noses. It's defeating the purpose, all right? And we know that. I know it's uncomfortable. I know you're fed up of everything, but let's do what we have to do so we can overcome together. All right, viewers, let's look at our Trinidad statistics, or Trinidad and Tobago. Tobago reports separately, and this is what was presented yesterday. So the Ministry of Health, their reporting is 4 p.m. daily. So this is what would have been released yesterday at 4 p.m. All right, I wouldn't go through everything. It's on your screen. We have total persons in home self-isolation, just over 5,200. We have deaths, I think that's total. All right, that's 1,026. Yes, that's total. If we can go to the page that gives us the statistics for that day. I don't know if we have that. This page we are seeing now is the total figures, but I want us to look at the figures given for the last 24 hours yesterday from Trinidad. So that will be your first page from Trinidad. So as we get that sorted out, yes, that's it there. So I just need to see the top of the page. So viewers, again, whatever your opinion is, let's learn to tolerate each other. It's okay if you think you don't need to be vaccinated, if you are responsible for you. But if I think I need to be vaccinated to protect myself, to protect my loved ones, don't throw stones at me. That's very unkind. We are Christians, right? We're supposed to have Christ's love. Don't let us stop majoring in minors. We all have opinions and we need to respect each other. Again, I remind us, those of us are very zealous, and I know that we really want to do what is right, and we are convinced we are doing what is right. But we have to tolerate others people's opinion and respect. Look at how Christ lived when he was on this earth. He, of all persons, could have been throwing big stone left, right, and center at everybody. He was Jesus. Perfect, right? Though he came as man. So let's learn from him. All right, so the figures were given yesterday. For some reason, I'm not seeing the figures very clear, but we can come back to that. And if my producer can let me know if Dr. Faith is online, all right, so she is waiting. I would have shared an introduction about who she is, and she will go ahead and present at this time. And when we come back, I will give you the correct WhatsApp number, I promise you. So Dr. Faith, welcome.
Thank you. Everyone's hearing me okay? Yes. Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure being here. I want to spend a little bit of time today answering some of the questions that may actually come up ahead of time, because I do know that many people reach out to me all the time, and they reach out to me with genuine concerns. Yes, there are a few people who really are against the vaccines, really are against those things, but I come across a large volume of people who really just have questions, and my aim this afternoon is to answer some of those questions for you. So I'm hoping that the producer will work with me and I'm able to get my slides coming up, because the first thing I want to chat about really quickly is to answer the question. I mean, we've been talking about COVID-19 for the last year and a half, but really, what is COVID-19? It's important to note that COVID-19 is the word COVID-19 is a disease that we get because we've been infected. COVID-19 represents coronavirus because it's a coronavirus that gives us the disease. And the 19 represents the year that we discovered coronavirus disease. So it's not like there was a COVID-1 or a COVID-2 or a COVID-3. No, we have a COVID-19 disease because it was discovered in the year 2019. The virus that we get the virus that gives us COVID-19 is known as SARS-CoV-2. And let me spell that out for you. It is a severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. And I'm sure when you think back to a couple years ago, you are aware of this concept known as SARS, because we've been hearing about SARS coming out of China. There were many times where we were talking about having our airports not allowing flights coming from China a couple years ago, maybe 7 to 10 years ago. And then we also heard about MERS again, having these kinds of diseases coming from some of the Asian countries. So this is the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, because it is really the second version of this kind of severe acute respiratory syndrome virus that is out there. I want to chat a little bit about how we spread the virus, because how we spread COVID-19, because how we spread it is really important to understand, because that would allow us to determine how we are able to live with it. Remember, as Natalie said earlier today, the title of my presentation really is Living with COVID-19, because we have kind of understood that the virus is not going to completely disappear. As much as we would love that to happen, it's not going to completely disappear. And we have to figure out how we are going to work with, how we are going to live with, how we are going to go to school with, how we are going to get back to traveling with COVID-19 being in the list of diseases that are there. So how is it spread? If you come into contact with an infected person, now it's important to know that the virus sits within our mucosal lining. What does that mean? When we talk about the mucosal lining, we're talking about the lining of the nose, the lining of the mouth, and to some degree, the lining of the eyes. So the virus can get into our mucus. You know, when we talk about mucus, when you have a cold, that thing that comes out when you cough and you spit out and that kind of thing, the virus can multiply and sits inside of the mucus. By the way, one of the reasons we tell you to wear a mask as well, even if you do not have a cold or a cough, is because the virus also is just in saliva. And that's a critical part for us to understand. If somebody is infected and you just talk to them, even though they may not be coughing, even though they may not be sneezing, the fact that they are talking means that they can actually spread the virus. Because I know many of us have had conversations where, you know, you're talking to somebody and, as we say in local parlance, you know, is leather boulders, because they really spitting coming out of, you know, you're really feeling all the wetness coming out of their mouth. And in those boulders is where the virus can actually move from one person to another person. And of course, if somebody, for example, touches their nose, touches their mouth, or they coughed into their hands, and then they touch a doorknob, and then you go and touch that doorknob, then you can get into contact with it. Now, that is why it's important to understand the measures that we have been giving to prevent the spread of COVID-19. One of the first measures is to wear your mask. Why are you wearing your mask? You're wearing your mask because the mucus, the virus spreads via mucus, and it's coming out of your mouth, it's coming out of your nose. So it's important, as Natalie was saying, that when you're wearing your mask, I know it is a little uncomfortable. For many of us, it's very uncomfortable. It feels like you can't breathe. It sounds like you sound funny. When people talking in it, you have to kind of pay a little closer attention to it. But that's okay. Because what we need you to do is ensure that you keep your nose and your mouth covered. I've seen people all the time just covering their mouth and leaving their nose exposed. And that in itself is pretty dangerous, because you can get the mucus also coming out of your nose when your mouth is covered, but it's coming out of your nose. The idea of social distancing, yes, staying at least 6 feet apart, because we've actually had a lot of studies done where we measured how far, in essence, the boulders fly. Or let's just say someone is sneezing, how far those particles float into the air. We've done those studies, and we've recognized that if you stay at least 6 feet apart, then those boulders, those mucus, if they come out of your mouth, they fall to the ground and they don't meet you. So when we talk about social distancing, that is why we are saying that, so that you can separate yourself, so that even if the person has COVID-19, even if the boulders are spreading, you are so far away from them that those will go out into the air, and because they are relatively heavy, they will fall to the floor before coming into contact with you. The other thing we talk about is to wash your hands, and we say wash your hands with soap and water. And this is very, very a very scientific way, even though it seems like it's a very simple mechanism. The coronavirus, if you look at the coronavirus, and I'm sorry I didn't have a picture of it, it is actually the RNA information about the virus. The genetic information of the virus is on the inside, and it is surrounded by a membrane. It is surrounded by a lining. Now, the thing about that lining is that soap causes it to wash away. Soap causes it to break away and rinse away. So when you wash your hands properly with soap and water, you are actually literally killing the outer coat of the virus, and therefore making the virus ineffective. So washing your hands with soap and water and washing it for a long time. And of course, the last one is sanitizing your surfaces. Just in case, now, for example, I am sitting here, I am not wearing a mask, I'm doing a lot of talking. It means that the laptop that is sitting right in front of me, there may be boulders rolling onto the laptop and falling onto the laptop. So I have to sanitize the laptop, I have to sanitize the table, I have to sanitize the items that are closest to me. So that's why it is so important for us to understand the various measures that have been placed out there, because these are the things that they may seem simple. But when we look at how the virus works, when we look at how the virus operates, when we look at what can kill the virus, these are some of the very simple measures that can be used to kill the virus. Now, I know that we have been, at first we were just talking about COVID-19. And within the last couple months, the word variant has been popping up like there is no tomorrow. We first started hearing about the UK variant, then we started hearing about the South African variant, and then we started hearing about the Brazilian variant. And now we're talking about an Indian variant. But if you realize, you've heard them actually then start change how we name the variant. So they decided, the WHO and other groups decided that instead of naming the variants based on where they came from, because that could be a little discriminatory, that could be a little, we don't want to go down that road. They started using Greek names. So we have the Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and the last one that is of such concern for us is the Delta variant. You hear even the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago talking about the fact that, because we now have our borders open, we now have to be concerned about the Delta variant coming in. Now, the Delta variant was originally discovered in India, but it has now gone all over the world. And this is a variant that is very, very, very transmissible. They're recognizing that it gets to you really quickly, even faster than the original and other versions. So let's talk about how these variants come about, because that's important for us to understand. When you come into contact with the SARS-CoV-2, the virus, it gets into your system. It binds to what is known as a receptor on your cells. And when it binds to the receptors on your cells, it allows, that then allows the genetic information about the virus to move into your cells. So that is the slide that speaks about how the virus multiplies. When the genetic information gets into your cells, it then tricks your body. It tricks your cells to start multiplying those viruses. So it goes through an entire process known as translation. And we're not going to go into what that means, but it goes through that process known as translation. And translation and multiplication and all of those things ends up with a situation where one virus goes into the cell, the virus tricks your body to start making other viruses, and then you end up with a situation with a whole lot of virus coming out on the other side of it. So one goes in, and then it's a multiplier. It's a factory happening inside of your body. Now, what happens when the variance takes place is that the genetic material that is inputted into the cell, that genetic material is multiplied. When you go back to the translation process, it's multiplied. The base of that genetic material is what is known as nucleotides. And nucleotides are the different things, that there are 4 of them. And based on the sequence that those nucleotides are placed, that determines what proteins are developed. What proteins are developed then determines how the virus comes out, and so forth. Now, what happens when you start having that kind of multiplication is that the virus normally multiplies exactly the way it should. In some instances, though, because everything does not work perfectly within the body, you may actually get a little shift in how the virus looks. So you may get a shift in how the nucleotides there are looking. So as you're seeing there, let's give an example of the original virus has a nucleotide sequencing of CGU. So it multiplies, it gets another CGU, CGU, CGU. But somehow in the midst of that multiplication, a mistake is made, and then that CGU CGU turns to GGA. Now, if you have a situation with that, that might mean that it changes a little bit. It may mean that it changes how the virus looks a little bit. It may cause it to die completely. But the horrible thing about what we're seeing with this coronavirus is that in some instances, when those changes happens, it actually creates a monster virus. And the other slide that includes the CGU turning into GUC, we recognize that this other version of the virus now, because those nucleotides, go on to the next slide, because those nucleotides are in a different position, this virus now is very, very dangerous. This virus now is one that is better at transmitting from one person to each other. So before when we were, let's say you're in a room, if you have one person who has COVID-19 and there are 10 people in the room, that one person may then transmit the virus to 2 or 3 other people. It seems like with this Delta variant, that one person is now transmitting the virus to 5 and 6 and 7 people in the room instead of the original one person. So it is transmitting quickly. It seems to be more resistant. So people who had a normal immune system, or people who may have had a slightly compromised immune system, their immune system is not able to fight against this virus at all, because this virus is just, this variant of it, this version of it has actually learned to become almost superhuman. So that is what is happening. That is what is happening, unfortunately, with these variants. So you are hearing people talking now that most of the cases that they are seeing all over the world are from this Delta variant, because this is the variant that seems to be transmitting faster. This is the variant that seems to be attacking you even worse. This is the variant that seems to be thriving. This is the variant that seems to, there are sometimes you get a bad cold and you just drink a little bit of orange juice, or you drink a little bit of lime juice and it goes away. But there are other times you get a cold and it seems like there's nothing that you can do to get rid of it. This virus seems to have learned, because it has been multiplying so many times in people, and it has been changing so many times. This newest version of it is really, really difficult for us to manage. And that is why it is so important for us to then talk about the other mechanism that is allowing us to help fight this virus. And that other mechanism is what seems to now be the most dreaded word in the whole wide world, that word known as vaccines. So what about these vaccines? One, Trinidad and Tobago, and I think Natalie did say, Trinidad and Tobago actually has one of the highest rates of vaccination in the world. It's one of the things we boast about. We ensure that we vaccinate our children against polio, measles, mumps, yellow fever. I mean, the list is very long. Many of you are very, very proud when you take your newborn and you dress them up at the 3-month period or the 6-month period and take them to get vaccinated. You take them to get immunized, and they give you the little immunization card. And when the children are about to go into preschool or primary school, they have to bring that immunization card as proof that they have been vaccinated. So taking a vaccine is actually nothing new, and Trinidad and Tobago is has been very, very forward thinking in our process of ensuring that most of us, if not all of us, are vaccinated as children. What COVID-19 is asking us to do now, though, is for us to vaccinate as an adult, for us to make that conscious decision to vaccinate as an adult. So let me talk a little bit about how the immune system works and how then the vaccines work to help the immune system. So our immune system is a whole sequence of cells and hormones and different things inside of our body that is there to fight against foreign attackers. So a virus comes in, a bacteria come in, a germ come in, the body is able to identify what it is, recognize that it is foreign, recognize that, hey, this is not something that's supposed to be here. This is not something that is good for me. Identify what it is, and then make things to attack against it. Now, the thing about the way the immune system works, though, is that it takes a little bit of time to go through that entire process. The immune system takes a little bit of time to go through the entire process of recognizing that there's a foreign body, identifying what that foreign body is, mounting a response to that foreign body, and then creating what are known as antibodies, which are basically the soldiers that are going to be in place to fight off that foreign body. The thing about COVID-19 is that for many of us, because our bodies are already weakened, because we have what are known as comorbidities, because we have diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, cancers, those other things, our bodies are already weakened. The way the virus attacks the body, it actually prevents it from doing that kind of immune response normally. And in some instances, though, the people who get very, very sick, and unfortunately the people who die, are the ones whose immune response could not have taken place in time to prevent the virus from multiplying the way it normally does, and to prevent the virus from attacking the other organs of the body the way it normally does. So what do the vaccines do? The vaccines allow your body lead time. You know, they say when if somebody's coming to pick you up and you say, well, you know, you're coming at 6 o'clock, but still, even though I know you're coming at 6 o'clock, when you're leaving home, call me, message me so that I know you're leaving home. And that gives me a little bit of time. I now recognize, okay, Miss So-so-so is coming. She left home. I know I have 10 minutes before she gets here. I now have lead time. That is what the vaccines do. They actually allow our bodies lead time. They allow our bodies to start going through that entire process of developing, of identifying that there is a virus, of going through the process of building the response to the virus before we have actually come in contact with the virus. So that period where it takes several weeks to go through the process of identifying, recognizing, identifying, mounting the response, and then finally getting the antibodies, the vaccines allow our bodies to go through that process before we come into contact with the virus. That way, by the time we come into contact with the virus, the body already has a series of antibodies, a series of army men waiting and ready to pounce, waiting and ready to defend the body. So that is something that is critical, and that is why we use vaccines for all other kinds of diseases, so that our body can develop the kind of response ahead of getting the actual disease. Now, I know one of the questions that I get all the time, so I'm going to answer it before anyone even asks, is about the vaccine approval process, because I know many people are concerned about the vaccines because there's an idea that these are experimental vaccines and that they are not approved. Now, it's important to know that when you go through the approval for any medication, whether it's a vaccine, another drug, another kind of technology, drugs go through, or whatever it is you're trying to determine whether we should use it or not, goes through what is known as a clinical trial. It goes through a clinical trial. And by the way, these vaccines have actually gone through those clinical trials. As you see on the screen, the clinical trials usually has phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then phase 4. But let's talk about a little bit about what happens even before you get to phase 1. Okay? Remember, I said very earlier that the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is a virus that has been around for quite some time. It's a part of the coronavirus family, and those viruses have been around for quite some time. So scientists have actually been spending time, even before 2019, even before 2020, looking at those viruses, trying to figure out what they were, trying to identify them, trying to look at their genetic material and all of that to try to figure out how to work against them. So there are scientists who've been working on this for a long long time. And because we've had the benefit, and I actually think that the fact that science has improved so much so that we have the benefit of science, a process that used to take a year, that used to take 5 years before, now only takes a short period. So as soon as they recognize the SARS-CoV-2, there were scientists who went quickly into their labs who were able to identify the genetic makeup. So they got the gene sequencing of the SARS-CoV-2. Now, learning what the gene sequencing is critical, because this is the information that a lot of the vaccines are using to tell our bodies that this is what you have to fight against. Okay, so let's go through the sequencing really quickly. Because that part happened quickly, and that part did not take a long time, as in recognition of the genetic sequencing. If you hear some of the scientists, for example, who created some of these vaccines, they would tell you that they got, for example, the data with the genetic sequencing on a Friday, and by Monday, because they had all of the critical information and because they'd been studying how to create vaccines all along, they were able over the weekend to create the vaccines. Now, that is an amazing feat, and we have to thank God that there were scientists all over the world who have this kind of knowledge and who have this kind of technology to do that for us. But that's not even part of the clinical trials process just yet. After those scientists have created the vaccines, what they then do is take it into what is known as phase 1 clinical trial. And phase 1 clinical trial usually happens with less than 100 people. It's usually about 50 people. And this is because they want to make sure that the thing that they're giving you is safe. They want to make sure that the thing that they're giving you is not giving some real wacky response and that you're not getting some horrible side effects. So they get volunteers, usually about 30, 40, 50 of those volunteers, to get the vaccine and to make sure that it is safe. Goes through that process. Only after they see that it has gone through phase 1 with those 50 or so people and it is safe, then it goes to what is known as phase 2 clinical trials. And what that is then you get a couple hundred people. It's usually less than 1,000. So it goes between 300, 400, 500 people. And then you start saying, okay, this medication, this is what it's supposed to do. Let me check to make sure that it is doing what it is supposed to do. It's a vaccine. The vaccine is supposed to prevent people from getting COVID-19 or prevent people from getting very sick with COVID-19. Let me check. Let's look at these volunteers, these 200, 300, 400, 500 volunteers, to make sure that it is doing that. They are also looking during phase 2 to still make sure that it is safe, but in phase 2, they are looking at, in addition to safety, whether it is doing what it says it should do. And then we go to the phase 3 of the clinical trials, which is the phase where you get thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So for example, Pfizer, if you look at the Pfizer reports, they tell you that they did their phase 3 clinical trials with 30 and 40,000 people in their phase 3 clinical trials. And that is what happens in all of the different regions. By the way, it's important to note that this process that I'm outlining is a process that is used in the United States, it's used in the UK, it's used in China, it's used in Russia, it's used in different areas. And it's also important to note that the regulatory agency, so for example in the United States, the regulatory agency is known as the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. The regulatory agency in the US deals with companies that do their work in the US. But there are regulatory agencies in China and there are regulatory agencies in the UK. In the UK, forever, it's known as, for instance, it's known as the EMA, the English Medicines Agency, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And they go through that process. What happens though is that usually, and you could go to the next slide really quickly, usually when we have time, meaning when we have a situation where where the drug companies are not in a rush to get the drug on the market, then you go through the normal process where you have to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, send your reporting from phase 3 to the regulatory agency, whether it's the FDA, the EMA, wherever. And only then, only after you've done phase 3, will the regulatory agency then say, hey, let's look at your data, let's look at all of your information. Now I am giving you authorization to start producing your medicine, producing your vaccine. Because we had a situation with COVID-19, though, where so many people were getting very sick, our hospitals were filling up, so many people were dying. Those vaccine pharmaceutical companies applied for what is known as emergency use authorization. And it's important to know that one of their two main differences with emergency use authorization. One of the main differences is during the phase 3 part of the clinical trials, when the FDA, when the regulatory agency sees that your data from phase 1 is good, your data from phase 2 is good, your data at the beginning, as in the first couple months of phase 3, is good, they then tell the companies, okay, we realize that you're getting good data so far. Go ahead and start manufacturing your vaccine or your drugs. We haven't given you approval yet to start distributing it, but you can go ahead and start manufacturing it, because we've seen so far that the data you've been collecting in phase 1, 2, and 3 so far is good data, and it means your drug is doing what it should do. It means that it is safe, and it means it's working. After, even though you have not gotten all the way to the end of phase 3, which usually takes months and months and months, because we are seeing your results, because your results seem to be holding, because you're getting good results, and it shows that it is safe, and it shows that it is doing what it should do, we then give you what is known as emergency use authorization approval, that then says the drugs or the vaccines that you were producing, you can now distribute. And that is why in the United States, for example, we would see one day where Pfizer, for example, says, oh, we just got our emergency use authorization approval from the FDA. And by the next day, you saw them bringing the Pfizer vaccine on the market. It's because Pfizer had been working for the last year and a half or so, going through the phase 1, phase 2, and parts of phase 3, started production early, and then as soon as they got that emergency use authorization, then they were able to start distributing. So I know several people continually say that the vaccines are experimental, or that the vaccines have not gone through the regulatory process. That is not true. Emergency use authorization, vaccines, or any other medication have actually gone through phase 1, phase 2, and a significant chunk of phase 3. What it did not do is wait for the end of phase 3 before the companies were then allowed to mass produce the vaccines and to distribute. So I think it's important that you understand that difference. So it is actually not accurate to say that the vaccines have not been approved. And by the way, even during this process where the phase 3 may not have been complete, all of these companies are still collecting data and still submitting their data to the regulatory agency to ensure that they are not seeing anything strange, to ensure they're not seeing anything that they did not pick up in phase 1, phase 2, and the early parts of phase 3. So now that we have that, let me just explain really, really quickly, how do our vaccines work? Because one of the things that is different about COVID-19 is how the vaccines work. The vaccines work, and you could skip to the other slide really quickly, by doing 3 main things. One, it prevents you from getting COVID-19. And let me explain that. Remember I said your immune system has been prepped, has been primed, has the antibodies to fight against the COVID-19. fight against the SARS-CoV-2, so to fight against the virus. So as soon as your body sees that it has come into contact with SARS-CoV-2, it already has the antibodies there to start attacking. For most people, it is able to attack and it's able to fight off the virus in such a way so you don't get infected at all. You don't get infected at all. For most people, that is what happens. The second way the virus, the vaccine helps you though, is because just in case you are one of those people who get what is known as breakthrough infection, meaning even though you have the vaccine, the virus made its way into you somehow. Yes, your body was fighting. Yes, your body was stinging, but the virus made its way into you somehow. And by the way, they're recognizing that for a lot of the people who have breakthrough infections, it may have actually been that their immune response may have been compromised in the first place because of some other disease or some other medication or something that they were taking. So they did not get the kind of immune response that we expected them to get from the vaccine. But even for those people, if they get what is known as a breakthrough infection, because the antibodies are already in place waiting to fight against the virus, even if the virus gets inside of you, it prevents it from multiplying the way we spoke about earlier up in the presentation. And because it prevents it from multiplying that way, it means there would be less virus inside of you, so that when you cough or when you sneeze or even when you talk and your pelting boulders, you don't have as much of the virus inside of you to spread out. Because the more of the virus that is inside of you, the more likely it is that you would then infect others when you speak or when you cough or when you sneeze. And the third way the vaccines help you is by preventing you from getting very sick and preventing you from dying. So again, because the antibodies are inside of your body, because you are already fighting against it, because it is preventing the virus from multiplying in your body, it is preventing it from forcing your body to get sick. It's preventing it from wearing down your body. It's preventing your body. It's actually giving your body a fighting chance. And because you have that fighting chance very early up, it means that you may not even get very sick. So they are recognizing, and this is data that's coming out of the US, coming out of UK, Canada, all over, that the people who are getting very sick with COVID-19, meaning the people who end up in hospitals or the people who are even dying, are people who have not been vaccinated. Those people who have gotten their vaccines and who have for some reason actually got infected, those people are getting very mild or very moderate infection, and they are not getting sick. And they have actually been pulling the data where if for some reason the individual got vaccinated and still got very sick and still somehow died, it was really, when they looked at it, it was really because that person may have actually had another disease or something else before that prevented their body from having the kind of immune response that they should have had. So that's how the vaccines work. Now, let me very quickly just identify, there are 3 different vaccines that are available in Trinidad and Tobago right now. I was about to say it to the public, but I'm not sure how public all of these are. The first one is the AstraZeneca. By the way, I took the AstraZeneca. That is a European, Oxford AstraZeneca. That's a European vaccine. And that works by basically it's using a different version of another common virus that they get from chimpanzees, and then they put in the genetic information about the SARS-CoV-2 and put that inside of you. That is how that works. By the way, this is a technology that they've been using for years and years and years for different vaccines. For the AstraZeneca, you need 2 doses. The first dose, after you get the first dose, you have to wait between 8 to 12 weeks after the second dose. So that's the AstraZeneca. That's the one I got. That's the one that was available up front. The other one that is available now is what is known as Sinopharm. And that is what we know as the Chinese virus. The Sinopharm vaccine, though, is actually using one of the oldest technologies that are available for vaccines. And the technology it's using is that they actually take the coronavirus, they take the SARS-CoV-2, but they kill it. They kill it so that it cannot infect you, but it still allows it to have it still has the spike protein on the outside of it, so that when it comes inside of you, your body recognizes it, and your body starts making antibodies against it. So it is the same SARS-CoV-2, but they have chemically killed it so that it cannot multiply inside of you, and that is what they've put inside of you. You cannot get COVID-19 from it because they have killed it, but your body is able to recognize it and start the process of start the immune response. With the Sinopharm, you get, it's 2 doses, and you get your second dose between 2 and 4 weeks after your first dose. And the third vaccine that is kind of available in Trinidad and Tobago is the Pfizer vaccine. And I say kind of because I'm sure we all remember all of the hoopla, all of the fact that we kind of had to hear about that vaccine coming in. That vaccine is actually using one of the newest technologies, which is where they pulled out the genetic material of the SARS-CoV-2, the messenger RNA, the mRNA. They've pulled out that information, and they've placed that information into a transportation kind of thing, and then put that inside you. Because remember when I spoke about how your immune response works, it first has to recognize that there is something foreign. It then has to identify that foreign thing. The way our body identifies the foreign thing is by looking at the genetic material of the foreign thing. And in this situation, what the Pfizer vaccine is doing is just giving us that information. So all you're getting is the genetic material. So you know, yes, this is what it is. This is what you need to make antibodies against. So it starts the process even faster, and you're going ahead. The Pfizer is the only vaccine thus far that we have in Trinidad and Tobago that has been approved for children. So I've heard the Prime Minister, and I think the Minister with responsibility for education, speak about the fact that they will be offering the Pfizer vaccine to children, to high school children, because that is approved right now for children over the age of 12 years old. And those are the 3 main types of vaccines that we have. I want to very quickly touch on traveling, because that is something that has come up quite a bit. It's important to note that different countries have different rules as it relates to traveling. So depending on what country you're going to, you have to look at their website, look at their government website to look at their specific rules. If you are allowed to enter the country, and that's a big if, because remember, even in Trinidad and Tobago, citizens are the ones who can come back. The same thing applies to Canada. If you are allowed to go into the country, then there are different rules for whether you are vaccinated or if you are unvaccinated. Usually, the individuals who are vaccinated, they just have to show a PCR test, meaning they have to show that they do not have COVID-19, and they then go about their lives. If you are unvaccinated and you are allowed to enter one of these countries, what they tell you is that you have to go into quarantine. You have to show that you are negative, one. You have to show that you are negative before you get on the plane, 3 days, at least 3 days before you get on the plane. When you get there, you have to show that you are negative, and then you have to go into quarantine. 7 days for some countries, 14 days for other countries, depending on where you go. And of course, for the various countries, the list of approved vaccines is different. The list of approved vaccines is slightly different. So you have to look at the country, determine whether you are allowed to go to that country, determine whether you have an approved vaccine, and then that will determine what happens if you are allowed to enter. So the bottom line is, we have to figure out how to live with COVID-19. We have to wash our hands, soap and water. We have to social distance, because that is what is preventing us from being too close to each other. We have to wear our mask and wear our mask properly. If you are sick, if you feel you're sick, if you feel you're having flu-like symptoms, if you know you've been in contact with somebody who is COVID positive, don't go to work. Call 800-HEAL if you are in Tobago, or 800-WELL if you're in Trinidad. Again, 800-HEAL if you are in Tobago. Let them know what your symptoms are. Let them know that you may have been in contact with your auntie or your nanny, or your friend is somebody who you heard just got COVID and you are not feeling well. Let them know, and then they would advise you on what to do. And of course, the last thing that we need to do in the whole grouping of options that we have is to get the vaccine, because the vaccine is what is going to give our body that fighting chance. The vaccine is what is going to give us that lead time, that headway. The vaccine is what is going to say, you have not come into contact with COVID-19 just yet, but we are prepping your body. We're allowing your body to start getting those armies ready and waiting, so that if and when you do come into contact with COVID-19, your army is there and your army is primed and your army is ready and waiting for that infection to fight against that infection. So that is how we have to live with COVID-19. Again, I will be around to hear whatever questions that you may have at the end. And please don't be afraid to ask any questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll simply say, I don't know the answer. I'll go research it and I'll come back with the answer another time. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in. And please, don't think that your question is stupid. Don't think that your question is not an important question. If you have a question, please, please, please ask it. That is the only way we can all be educated and we can make an informed decision. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Faith, for presenting. And for those of you who may have missed the introduction, you just heard from Dr. Faith B. Israel. She's a social scientist. Her background is in public health. She's also the area representative for Goodwood Bell Garden West right here in Tobago. And as she shared with us, she will be sticking around for questions. We will have our questions a bit later on. And let me tell you where you can send your questions, because in my excitement, I mixed up my numbers, right? So it's 767-0020. Did I get it right, guys, this time? So 767-0020. That's our WhatsApp number, so you can send your questions via that. Or if you prefer email, asitobago@gmail.com. That's asitobago@gmail.com. So as your moderator, I would have mentioned for us to be tolerant of each other. And I want us to understand that this is your choice. It's okay to choose to be vaccinated. It's okay to choose not to. It's not a requirement to enter kingdom. And many of us, we're really getting emotional about this. Our job here, or our goal at ASI, and we worked along with the Tobago Mission of Seventh-day Adventists for the last 2 weeks in bringing information, because as God's people, we need to make wise choices. How do you make a wise choice? By researching, getting facts, seeking out information, so that you now are informed. So this is simply presenting information to you. We are not telling you from ASI that you are no good if you are vaccinated, or you are no good if you are not. So again, let me remind you, the church's position is that this is an individual choice. And what we did over the last 2 weeks, what we did was clear up some misconceptions, because we have some real energetic members who were sharing positions that did not represent the World Organization or the local church. And we just wanted people to be aware, as Seventh-day Adventists, where we take that stand. And when I say we, I mean the global church. Here on ASI Media, and I think one of our YouTube viewers alluded to that and thanked us for allowing everyone access to information, because sometimes you may not have the time to do all the research on your own. And we are very careful in ensuring that the persons who are presenting are qualified in their field. Again, none of our presenters are saying you have to take it or you don't have to take it. Information, pray, ask God to allow you to make that right choice. Dr. Faith would have also answered about 3 or so questions already that came in. So I hope the viewers who sent in those questions would have heard. And I always forget our Facebook viewers. Please forgive me. I appreciate your presence. I am glad that you are joining us this afternoon. And please share the link as well, so others can tune in and receive information. And I just want to mention, before we meet our next panelists and listen to some special music, because I think some of us need to listen to music to meditate, to calm us down a bit. I see some excitement happening in our YouTube chat, and I don't want anything to distract us from the information presented. So I know some of you, and you have that freedom, again, to share your opinion. but let's allow each other to listen to the information presented. Again, being vaccinated is no requirement to enter the kingdom. But as God's people, we need to be responsible. So you decide, again, you decide. I made my decision. You decide whether you wish to be vaccinated or not. And some people were very against it, and they have come around. Some people are saying no, and that's okay. We all God's children, and we have to stop majoring in minors. Do you know that expression? Let me say it again. Let's stop majoring in minors. All right? So I just want to mention something quickly that Dr. Faith mentioned, and it came to my mind listening to one of the presenters from last week, where the same question was asked Dr. Faith about, this vaccine and emergency approval, and how can a vaccine be created so quickly. And Dr. Faith would have mentioned, we live in a different time. The technology is their communication. And I remember thinking that. I would imagine in the 1800s when they have to develop vaccines, you couldn't have collaboration in real time. A scientist had to take a ship from somewhere to go to some other country. That took months. Or when they wrote their letters on paper and had to rely on snail mail, information will take months before it reaches that other person and adjustments made. But we communicate in real time. Here I am with you having a discussion wherever you are in this world, as though we are in each other's presence. So for some, it may seem as, that's suspicious. How did a vaccine come about so quickly? But we have to understand, and I want us to be real about it. I'm not trying to convince you to take the vaccine or not. That's not why I'm here. But I'm encouraging us to think about what's happening. Think about what people are saying. You too, examine the information presented, whether you agree with it or not, and that's quite okay. But don't bring down your brother and sister who may have a different opinion. Don't go out there and misrepresent the Seventh-day Adventist Church and say things that the church did not or does not ascribe to. All right, so these are just reminders. So let's be a little more kind to each other in our chat, our live chat, right? Because if we shut it down, you all will say we're bad. But it's about maintaining respect. And if it is that we continue to be a bit out of line, because it's happening, it's borderline right now, we will have to shut it down. And we don't want to, because you have that choice to express yourselves. All right? So we will hear some music from Sister Tanisha soon, and when we return, I would introduce you to our next panelist, Renee Joseph. All right, and earlier on, we heard special music from Sophia and her mom, Anne. Yes, that was Sophia's mommy, and we are so happy that mommy is here and was able to share in ministry with her daughter. Powerful singing, and I'm sure you will be blessed by Tanisha at this time.
Your eyes is on the sparrow, in your hands it comforts me. From the ends of the earth to the depth of my heart, let your mercy and strength me see. You call me to your purpose, as angels understand. For your glory, may you draw all men, as your love and grace demands. And I will run to your words of truth, not by might, not by power, but but by the Spirit of God. Yes, I will run the race till I see your face. Oh, let me live in the glory of your grace. You call me to your purpose, as angels understand. For your glory, may you draw a man as your love and grace demands. Yes, I will run to your words of truth, not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit of God. Yes, I will run the race till I see your face. Oh, let me live in the glory of your grace. Yes, I will run to your words of truth, not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit of God. Yes, I will run the race till I see your face. Oh, let me live in the glory of your grace. Oh, let me live in the glory. I want to live in your glory. Yes, let me live in your glory of your grace.
Welcome back, viewers, and if you are joining us right now in the middle of our program, you are viewing ASI Media Tobago, and our topic this afternoon, the vaccination dilemma. What work has to do with it? You'd have just missed a presentation from Dr. Faith where she spoke about living with COVID-19. It is a reality we may have to examine, think about, and face. And of course, part of living with it means we will have to also know how to work and do whatever we do daily, you know, as we go about our lives. So I want to welcome you if you are now joining us. As I said, for those of you who have been with us from the beginning of the program, thank you for staying with us, and I encourage you to share the link because we still have some information for you. Joining us is our next panelist, Renee Joseph, who's a young attorney at law. And for those of you who know her, she's very passionate about justice and equity. She is a member of the Brazil SDA Church, and that's in Arima, the Arima district rather, and has been a Seventh-day Adventist for just about 28 years and believes that her calling is in youth ministry. Renee holds a Bachelor of Law degree from the University of the West Indies and a Master of Laws degree in International Law and International Relations from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Renee is actively involved in AY. She is an AY leader and is very proud about that. And she's also one of the leaders in Pathfinder Club. Renee embodies the motto of the Pathfinder Club to be a servant of God and a friend to man, even in her professional sphere, and maintains that whatever her hands find her to do, she will do it with all her might. And we are so happy that she could take time out to spend some time with us this afternoon as she looks at living with COVID-19, in particular, looking at the work environment. For those of you following the news again, you are hearing people asking, is it mandatory? Will it be employers versus employees? Looking at, the rights of an individual versus the rights of the public collectively, etc. So I'm sure Renee in her presentation will shed some light on that. And I want to remind you, at the end of her presentation, we will move into our Q&A sessions. We have both Dr. Faith and Renee with us, and questions that pertain to their presentation, their expertise. Those are the questions we can entertain this afternoon. All right, other questions you may ask, we will try to send it out to, if it's, something with theology, to a pastor, and probably post it at a later date, or see how best we can communicate with you, because we really want clarity. So let me allow Renee to lead out at this moment. Thank you, Renee, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so very much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone, and a pleasant Sabbath to all. So this afternoon, the focus of my presentation will be on the workplace. In the words of one of my dear friends, Pastor Newsom, the job and your job. All right, the job and your job. So that's essentially what we're going to focus on. We're going to try to respond to the concerns that our community and citizens have with respect to the mandatory vaccination. So at this time, as you see on the screen there, we're going to deal with the vaccination dilemma. So I want to start the presentation off this afternoon with 5 disclaimers. All right, 5 disclaimers. So you're going to see there on the screen that 1, there is no present law or policy in place that governs the issue of the mandatory vaccination. All right, the government has not yet passed any law requiring a mandatory vaccination. Now, the issue with respect to mandatory vaccination, or the vaccination in general, marries several arms or areas or fields of law. So you have labor laws that govern the workplace, but then you have public health laws and policies that govern the pandemic and how our country responds to the pandemic and safeguards its citizens against the pandemic. Then you have the human rights laws that dictate the entitlements of citizens and what should not restrict those entitlements, or in what circumstances those entitlements could be restricted. And so you have an amalgamation of laws that will actually inform the issue of the mandatory vaccination. It's important for me to underscore, however, that human rights are not absolute. Okay, so they are not these infallible rights that you have, all along without any sort of restriction or limitation. And so we're going to explore the lengths and breadths of which your human rights can be limited as a result of the mandatory vaccination, or in general, the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So, when we look at it, our human rights are enshrined within the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. So in section 4 of the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, you would see there that it is hereby recognized and declared. So it is these rights you have are inherent by virtue of the fact that you are human. All right. So it is recognized and declared in Trinidad and Tobago that they have existed and shall continue to exist. So I want to highlight, first of all, your human rights are not created by this instrument. This instrument he had. All right. So existed and continue to exist without any form of discrimination, whether it's race, origin, color, religion, sex, the following fundamental human rights. All right, so they're basic, these are the rights that every being human, that they must be afforded because they are human. Liberty and security of the person, enjoyment of one's property, and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. Then we have the right of the individual to equality before the law. All right, you have equality before the law and the protection of the law. Next slide. You have also the right of the individual to respect for your private life and your family life. So I want to put a little asterisk here because this is one of the rights that will concern the mandatory vaccination. All right, respect for your privacy and your family life. You also have the right to equality of treatment from any public authority in the exercise of their function. Needless to say, the health services and the institutions which offer us health services would fall under the umbrella of state entities. All right, so we're going to put an asterisk next to this right as well. Then you have the right to join political parties and to express political views. You have the right of a parent or guardian to provide a school of his own choice for the education of his child or ward. Next slide. And then you have all the freedoms. So this one is primarily where many of our rights have already been affected because we're under state of emergency. We have curfews imposed, very strict fines being levied against persons who breach the policies and the regulations in respect of the state of emergency and the pandemic. So you have this number G, or letter G, freedom of movement. Put an asterisk next to that because obviously that has already somewhat been infringed upon. Freedom of conscience and religious belief and observance, freedom of thought and expression. Let's put an asterisk next to that, not necessarily with respect to how the state relates to us, but with respect to how we relate to each other on the issue of vaccination. Then we have freedom of association and assembly, which has also been impacted because before where you could have gathered in large numbers for whether it's a celebratory function or if it's just to hang out by the corner with your friends and you drink a Malta, that has also been impacted. And then finally, we have the freedom of the press. So we have just about 5 or so rights that are impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and about 3 or so that are affected as a result of this discussion on mandatory vaccines. Pandemic. So we have our human rights, and as I said, our governments have recognized, they have a duty or responsibility to recognize human rights and more so to safeguard our human rights. Let's look at Section 5 of this Constitution. Section 5 of the Constitution, next slide. So Section 5 of the Constitution says, except as is otherwise expressly provided in this chapter or in Section 54, no law may abrogate, abridge, infringe, or authorize the abrogation, abridgment, or infringement of any of our human rights. All right, so Section 5, if you had any doubt about the government's responsibility to protect our human rights, Section 5 delineates it very clearly and without ambiguity. No law may abrogate, abridge, or infringe upon any of the human rights that the Constitution recognizes and provides for us. However, before we go into a praise dance and a happy dance over Section 5, let's jump to Section 13 of the Constitution. So we have Section 13. It says, an act to which this section applies may expressly declare that it shall have effect even though inconsistent with Sections 4 and 5. So they'll never outrightly say that, of course, it infringes upon it, but it's inconsistent, which means that in some way it imposes a restriction or limitation on the rights outlined in Section 4 and that prohibition on the infringement of our rights outlined in Section 5. So we have here, let's jump to the last part. If any such act does so declare, as in, if any act is inconsistent with the rights of Section 4 and 5, it shall have effect. Once we can show that it is reasonably justifiable in a society that has a proper respect for the rights and freedoms of the individual. So I want to highlight here, this we commonly refer to this as the act that seeks to infringe upon or abrogate our human rights must be reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. That's the shortened form of it that we relate to in the law. But it is a society that has proper respect for the rights and freedoms of the individual. So it follows, therefore, that there is a wide margin of appreciation when it comes to the recognition of human rights and what acts or legislation would be permitted to somewhat infringe on or be inconsistent with the safeguarding of our human rights. And that act must be reasonably justifiable in what we call a democratic society. So when we look at the next slide, we will see there the first criteria for abrogation of our human rights. Now, for those who may be children or teenagers among us, abrogation is a big word that simply means to evade, overturn, to repeal, to quash, to infringe upon. All right. So these acts or pieces of legislation passed after our Constitution have some sort, or impose rather, some sort of restriction or limitation on our human rights. So the first criteria to have an act do so is it must be reasonable. What is that? Is it just, fair, rational, and appropriate for the particular situation? Would a reasonable, right-thinking individual in society look at these circumstances and say that this action or this legislation is fair and a rational approach or response to the circumstances that we are prevailing or we have prevailing at this time? All right? So that's the first criteria for any act or any legislation, any regulation, any policy to restrict or limit our human rights, reasonableness. Next slide. When we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we look at Article 29(2) in particular, and we see there that in the exercise of human rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to limitations as determined by law. And we need to underline that rather. Only limitations that are determined by law. So essentially, there must be some law or regulation that imposes a limitation. But let's look at how this law may be implemented or introduced. It must be solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect. So at all times, you must seek to recognize and respect the fundamental rights and freedoms. All right? So solely for the purpose of doing that, but there's an addendum, and of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare of a democratic society. So we see there that while on one hand, you have to recognize and respect the rights and freedoms of the individuals, on the other hand, you have to meet requirements of public morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society. So here we have, or we make mention now of the Universal Declaration. It makes mention of what is the second criteria for abrogation. That is proportionality. So whatever action that is imposed or solution that is decided upon, it must not exceed what is required to meet the objective. And here we have, in the slide before, we have that objective is to safeguard the general welfare of a democratic society. So we're saying, therefore, that whatever the government or the powers that be imposes, it must be proportionate to whatever the sought objective is. It must not be too austere or severe or exceed that which is required to meet the objective of protecting the general welfare of our society. Next slide. Now, so we have thus far, we have reasonableness and then we have proportionality. But while the Trinidad and Tobago may not necessarily have signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we did, however, sign on and ratify, I should say, two international covenants that basically encapsulated the rights and freedoms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in more detailed forms. Those are, the first one, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Trinidad and Tobago ratified this convention or covenant in December of 1978. And an Article 12 of that convention, you would see, everyone lawfully within the territory of a state shall, within that territory, have the right to liberty of movement and freedom to choose his residence. This right shall not be subject to any restriction except those, again, provided by law. So we're seeing some repetitive language here. All right? No restriction except those provided by law and are necessary to protect, let's look at them, national security. Right? So we have the issue of national security definitely raising its head with the pandemic. Public order. Now, it's no secret to all of us that the Honorable Prime Minister had to shut down this country on numerous occasions because we did not exhibit public order. We didn't line up, we were crowding around, we were not wearing our mask properly, etc. And so we had to go into lockdown. Public health. Now, it stands that the issue of the pandemic is an issue of public health because it is disseminated by our interaction with each other, as Dr. Faith would have mentioned before, the means through which it is spread. All right, and the morals or rights and freedom of others. So let's look at this. While we have individual human rights, and our human rights as outlined in section 4 of our constitution is afforded to each individual regardless of race, color, creed, religion, gender. All right, what we have here being brought out is that the rights of others must be recognized. So you have therefore the issue of your individual rights as opposed to the rights of those around you. So this is saying that sometimes restrictions may have to be imposed by law to protect the right of the masses. So your individual right is being infringed upon because it's important to protect the rights of the community. All right. And of course, it says and are consistent with other rights recognized in the convention. All right. So we have there now, what we see there is the third criteria for abrogation. It is necessary to protect national security, public order, public health, or morals and freedom of others. So the third criteria for abrogation, next slide, is necessity. This is the presence of the circumstances, the present circumstances justify and compel a certain course of action. So it is necessary for us to take this action if we are to protect our society for public security, public health, public order, public morals and freedoms of the collective, of the masses. All right. And I think we would have heard our Honorable Prime Minister making mention of that during his statements. It has become necessary for us to go into another period of lockdown in an effort to mitigate the increasing numbers. All right. So we see there our three tiered tests. All right. The three factors or criteria that must be present to afford or impose some infringement upon our human rights. They are reasonableness, proportionality, and necessity. All right? So, when we look at this, therefore, in light of the pandemic, is it reasonable, proportionate, and necessary to impose vaccinations, to impose the mandatory vaccination? So let's jump in now. Having set this platform and laid this foundation, let's jump in to the whole focus now of your job and the jab. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we have the balancing act, all right? So we have the collective rights. as are necessary to protect what are the collective rights, national security, public order, public health, morals, or the rights and freedoms of ours. So there is sometimes a necessary imposition on the individual human rights to protect the rights of the mass. And it's a balancing act that the government has to do all the time. To what degree do we have to go to ensure that the collective rights of the community are safeguarded without infringing too far upon the individual rights of the person, all right, to their freedom of movement, freedom of association, etc. Next slide. So we see there, therefore, that in respect of collective rights, let's talk about the vaccine. Now, Seth Berkley is an American epidemiologist, and he's a global advocate for the power of vaccines. In fact, he's the founder and former president and CEO of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. And Seth Berkley says that vaccines directly lead to a healthy workforce, which is critical to long-term development and prosperity in all countries. Now, I don't think any of us could deny that. A country's greatest resource, of course, is its human resource. All right. And so you have to ensure that if a country is ready to thrive, it must invest in its citizens, because as its citizens become productive and they give back to the country, and the country as well develops and prospers. And so Seth Berkley is advancing that the vaccines, to ensure that we have a population that is healthy, directly correlates to the development and prosperity of our country. Next slide. Now, none of us can deny that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is a public health crisis. Given the scope of limitations of rights, as in when we can in fact limit a right, as I highlighted before, reasonableness, proportionality, necessity. All right. The mandatory vaccination may be justified or could be justified on the grounds of the protection of the collective right of public health. But remember, our pieces of legislation and the articles or clauses of the international treaties mention that it must be provided for by law. So we don't have a law, as I mentioned at the start, one of my disclaimers, there is no law or policy yet imposed by the government or voted by the government to impose or infringe upon our human rights. So let's look at international law. Given that we do not have any local laws, let's consider international law. That's my area, all right? So we're going to look at the International Covenant now on economic, social, and cultural rights. So, economic, social, and cultural rights, again, Trinidad and Tobago also ratified this convention in 1978. So this is the second convention or covenant, either or, both words could be used interchangeably, that speaks to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the rights outlined therein as fundamental rights and freedoms in more detailed form. So the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 12, says that the states that are present or party to the convention recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Now, not just did they recognize the rights of individuals to the highest possible standard of health, physical and mental, all right, because we can't underscore or overlook enough, right? We can't underscore enough or overlook, rather, the fact that our mental health is also being affected as a result of the pandemic, all right? So this section or this article actually imposes upon governments and states a duty to safeguard this right. So let's look at Article 12.2. It says, the steps to be taken by the state parties to the present covenant to achieve the full realization of this right. So states have a duty to take certain steps to achieve the full realization of this right. And it includes what? C. 12.2c says, the prevention, treatment, and control of epidemic, endemic, occupational, and other diseases, aka pandemic. All right. So states have a duty to take necessary steps. All right. As we see there, necessary steps to prevent and treat any disease, which includes the COVID-19 disease. All right. So let's move on. Slides. Next slide. So keeping this in mind, the duty of the states to protect us, we could understand why the government would have placed us in lockdown. It was a step that was, as our Honorable Prime Minister said, necessary to safeguard us against the spread of the COVID-19 virus. Now, let's look at employers. The state has the responsibility. Human rights bind the state. It is for the state to recognize, uphold, and safeguard these fundamental rights and freedoms. So you see it outlined in the preamble of most of these international treaties, whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve, in cooperation with the United Nations, the promotion of the universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. All states have a duty to recognize, uphold, and safeguard human rights and fundamental freedoms. However, some employers are not state actors. So we have, therefore, whereas state institutions recognize, well, have to, because they, of course, they're state entities. So as essentially as they are, what should I call them, tributaries of the state, they also have a duty to recognize and uphold and safeguard fundamental rights and freedoms. Most employers, however, many of us, are not employed in the public sector. We are employed by the private sector. So, is there a duty upon the private sector to safeguard, uphold, and recognize the fundamental rights and freedoms? I can tell you this. Right now, in respect of the COVID-19 pandemic, the trend is to have workers vaccinated where the workplace is a high-risk environment. So that's like the healthcare system, travel system, schools. Those environments where there's a lot of one-on-one interaction, that not necessarily complies with the 6 feet apart rule. Children in school, healthcare workers when they have to lean to give you an injection, of course, they are infringing upon the 6 feet apart. All right, travel, the stewardesses who have to come and serve us or respond to some sort of emergency in flight. So it follows, therefore, that these are high-risk work environments, and the current trend there is to have the workers vaccinated. Because as Dr. Faith says, when you are vaccinated, in the event that you do attract or you do catch the COVID-19 virus, rather, what happens is that the vaccine gives you a better chance of survival and fighting off the virus. Now, let's look at the next slide. There are advantages and risks, of course, in taking that sort of action. So, when we look at the advantages, of course, we have non-state actors now working along with the state for the protection of the employee and other employees, and of course, the public at large, which ultimately all entities serve. All right. So with respect to the protection of the employee, the individual employee, the protection of employees in the workplace in respect of their interaction with each other as they seek to perform their duties, and then your service to the public. So that's an advantage. You also have the advantage of a safe system of work. Now, employers have a duty of care to the employees to provide a safe system of work. And a safe system of work includes an environment that is free from disease. All right? So those are the advantages. Now let's look at some of the risk for the employer. Now these may not necessarily be risk necessarily to the employer, but factors that they have to keep in mind with respect to requiring employees to take the vaccine. What are the risks? One, you have a potential breach of employment law, because employers are not allowed to unilaterally change the terms of reference or the terms of employment. All right, there must be consensus generally between the employer and the employee. This is what I'm hiring you to do, and the employee understands this is the scope of my duties, my scope of works. All right, so where there's a unilateral change of the terms of employment, that could leave the employer exposed to liability, and an action before the industrial court for breach of the employment relationship. All right. Now, you also have factors such as religious objections. So, there are some religious bodies who do not subscribe to modern medication. All right. As you know, one that immediately comes to most of our minds may be the Jehovah's Witnesses. All right. So, we know, therefore, that there would be religious objections to taking the pandemic. And as we indicated, a person cannot be forced to take it if it is that it infringes upon their religious objection with the absence of law governing same. All right. Now, let's look at number 3 factor, health complications. Now, what are the health complications? It is that some persons have comorbidities. We heard the government mention it, whether it's asthma or diabetes or hypertension, as the case may be. And sometimes exposure to the vaccine could complicate their health situation. And so that's also a factor that employers must keep in mind in seeking to require persons to take the vaccination. And finally, you have employer's liability. Now, this is an other side of the risk now. This is where if an employer does not necessarily force or mandate employees to take the vaccine, what happens? It means, therefore, that persons coming into that environment could be exposed to the virus, and employers have, as I said, a duty to provide a safe environment for work. So they know it's almost as if they're exposed to liability if they do, and they're exposed to liability if they don't. All right, next slide. So let's look now as to what are the duties and obligations of the employer. Again, found in the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which Trinidad and Tobago ratified in 1978. Article 7 of that says, states party to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to enjoyment of just and favorable work conditions, all right, which ensure in particular safe and healthy working condition. So we have there, therefore, that the employer does have a duty of care to the employees, to also persons coming to the establishment, to provide a safe system. All right, safe and healthy working conditions for the employee and a safe environment for the conduct of business for the public. So it is on this premise that many present employers are now stating through the media that they require the employees to be vaccinated before they return to work. Remember, I said, however, that our human rights cannot be infringed without some form of law being passed. All right, so no abrogation of the right can take place without it being necessary for national security, public order, public health, as the case may be. All right, now let's look at it. Therefore, can the employer mandate that the vaccination be taken by its employees? Can they take it a step further, threaten that the employee will be terminated if they do not take the vaccine? So let's explore termination. We want to go back to our 3-tiered test. Is it reasonable? So, is this a just, fair, rational, and appropriate response for the particular situation? I would submit it is not. All right. So at the end of the day, many of us we have to coexist within the environment of the pandemic. And so, given, therefore, the economic crisis that most countries are facing as a result of the lockdown, as a result of the purchase of vaccines, etc., most individuals within countries are also facing economic or financial difficulty as a result of being laid off from jobs, or their hours and days have been reduced. I think it would be very oppressive of employers to terminate on the grounds of not taking the vaccine. So it may not, by a right-thinking person, be deemed to be reasonable. Is it proportionate? Well, we'll look in a short while at some of the alternatives, because remember, we're saying that the solution must not exceed what is required to meet the objective. So what you really want to maintain is a safe system of work. You have to provide a safe environment for your employees and the public to interact in. Is termination really the factor or the solution to establishing that objective? And then we have, is it necessary to terminate the employment of your unvaccinated employee? All right. Is that justified? Is that necessary, or are you compelled to terminate because they did not take the course of action, and that is to take the vaccine? Next slide. So we have the issue of termination. Now let's look at the International Convention on Economic and Social Rights again. All right. So we have there in Article 6, we see that states party to the present covenant recognize the right to work. So therefore, an employer terminating an employee on the grounds of them not taking the vaccine could be deemed to be an infringement of their right to work, which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work which he freely chooses or accepts, and will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right. So again, we see that the government or the state has a duty to take appropriate steps to safeguard the right of its citizens to work. Now, let me just say this. The right of the citizen to work, unlike other rights that I would have read before, does not have a proviso that says a restriction or a limitation may be imposed on this right by virtue of law. All right. So it follows, therefore, that in treating with the issue of mandatory vaccination, the government has somewhat of a balancing act to do, because the right to work is not necessarily one that could easily be infringed upon. All right. They must take steps to safeguard this right. And so where an employer acts to terminate an employee because he or she refuses to take the vaccination, then it may be that the state has to step in to safeguard this right. So I would give you an example. For example, when we first went into lockdown and businesses were closed and persons had to be laid off, you recall that the government indicated that there is an unemployment grant that they gave to people to tide them through the lockdown, because the government recognizes and understands that they have to take appropriate steps to safeguard the right to work, which includes the right to remuneration for your work. All right. So next slide, you see it there. I want to look at another slide or another convention, which is one of our local convention, the Patients Charter of Rights and Responsibilities. Now, this was introduced by the Honorable Minister John Rahel in 2007. And Minister Rahel, in this Patient Charters of Rights and Responsibilities, you will see two articles that I want to bring to your attention. One, Article 9, consent. So you have the right to be informed about and to participate in the decisions related to your health and treatment. Wherever possible, this should be based on a clear and concise explanation of your condition and of all the implicit technical procedures, including the possibilities of any risk of death or serious reactions, and of problems related to your recovery and a satisfactory outcome. In other words, you have the right to make an informed decision, and it continues there with consent. You should not be subjected to any procedure without your voluntary informed consent. So I think it would be true to say that many of us have skepticism or hold fear towards the vaccination because we feel as though we're not getting information or a comprehensive response as to the benefits and the risk associated to the vaccine. Now, there are those of us who are just spreading a whole set of conspiracy theories and propaganda. I'm not talking about you need Jesus. I'm talking about the persons who you are genuinely maybe interested in obtaining or getting your job, but you are concerned because you're hearing all of these situations arising with persons who they took the vaccine and then their health took a downward turn. All right. And I know that there are instances, and we feel as though there is this big cover up in respect of, are they really telling us the truth of the vaccine, or why aren't they just simply owning up to the fact that, listen, there is a chance of your health taking a downward spiral in the event of the vaccine? I think many of us would be more comfortable if we know, okay, there is a 20% risk, or whatever the case may be, and we can then now make an informed decision. And that's your right. All right, that's one of your rights, that at the end of the day, you're supposed to get a clear and concise explanation as to the benefits and the risk associated with any treatment that you are going to attempt or procedure you're going to undertake. Now, that same patient's Charter of Rights and Responsibilities says in Article 11, you also have the right to refusal of treatment. So you can refuse treatment. That's literally what it says. The first 4 words of that clause says you can refuse treatment. All right? And so we need to recognize, therefore, as employers, that persons have the right, if they feel as though they are not getting the information that they require to make an informed decision, they do have the right to refuse treatment. And this right is to be respected by the employer until such time as the person thinks they have sufficient information as to the benefits and the risks, and they submit themselves to the vaccination process. Next slide. So we see, therefore, that ultimately I want to highlight it's a balancing act. All right, we have the collective rights, next slide, versus the individual rights. So let's look at what these collective rights and the individual rights entail with respect to employer and employee. The realities are, persons without the vaccine are not more susceptible to contracting the virus. The reality is, if we do not observe the policies and guidelines, everyone is equally susceptible to contracting the virus. If we don't avoid touching our mouth and our eyes and our nose, if we don't wear our mask, if we don't maintain the 6 feet distance, if we don't wash or sanitize our hands, then everybody has equal susceptibility and vulnerability to contracting the virus. 2, taking of the vaccine doesn't preclude a person from contracting the virus. As Dr. Faith would have said, you may still contract it, however, you will have a higher possibility of survival, of your body fighting off the virus. 3, the lack of clear and consistent information is the major cause of skepticism about the virus. And so you have persons, as I said, carrying it to the extreme. But generally, for those who are rational, fair-minded individuals, there's a degree of fear because they think that, listen, can you possibly die from taking the vaccine? Just be straight with us and tell us what is the risk, and we ourselves would have discussions and we would make the decision accordingly. And you have as well, there is almost an agenda, you could say. In respect to the media, everybody is touting the virtues of the vaccine, and there are many, but nobody is really mentioning the risk associated with the vaccine. And I think that imbalance of information, and also the silencing of persons who will speak out to say, well, this XYZ person took the vaccine and then they got ill, you recognize that those types of posts and comments in mainstream media and on social media are somewhat being muzzled and removed, etc. So that feeds into the fear and into the skepticism that citizens have about the vaccine. And then 4, employers, based on all that I've said today, based on the rights of the citizen, or the individual rather, to refuse treatment, based on the right of the individual to have a clear and informed explanation, a comprehensive explanation rather, so that they could make an informed decision. The right of the employee to work and to not necessarily have that right imposed or infringed upon without due process of law. Employers are therefore cautioned against taking a mandatory approach to vaccination in the absence of law or policy to govern same. So let's look at alternatives for the employer. Somebody here may have a business or an establishment and you're wondering, well, I don't want that I am exposed to somebody suing me because they come to say they contract the COVID virus in my establishment. So what can you do? So you do have alternatives. You have the rotation of staff. All right, so you could have some home working arrangements and office days, etc., to rotate staff, ensuring, of course, that you do have the proper sanitization processes in place, which I don't think will ever go away. So once you're interacting with public and persons will be coming to your establishment, then you'll need to have that there anyway. All right, rotation of staff. You have the possibility of isolation. I saw a meme yesterday on Facebook with persons who are vaccinated and persons who are not vaccinated on the beach. And they had a demarcation saying who could go to which section of the beach. And on the side, that was marked vaccinated. Crowds, persons lying down on top of each other sunbathing. But on the side, that was like not vaccinated. People had space and they were just there relaxing, etc. Now, the reality is that's a funny way to deal with a serious situation. But it may be something that you will have to introduce in your establishment. Isolation, so that there is limited interaction with the person who may not be vaccinated. It will not be deemed a form of discrimination, but rather an additional safeguard to ensure that you provide a safe system and environment for work. You may also wish like to introduce PPE. Now, I've seen many of the healthcare services doing this. They've provided masks. Some of them have provided gloves. I recognize now in respect of funeral homes, they have on the entire suits to protect them and safeguard them when they're moving bodies who have passed away with the COVID-19 pandemic. So you may want to introduce additional PPE and have it there for the safeguard of your employees. And of course, you cannot overlook the importance of awareness campaigns. Repetition breeds recollection, and so you want to ensure that you continuously, as I saw it on this is on Google, everyone, and it's been trumpeted by many healthcare systems around the world. Avoid men. That's touching your mouth, your eyes, and your nose, and follow women. Hey, don't shoot the messenger, okay? So follow women. W, wash your hands. O, obey the 6 feet social distancing. M, mask up. E, exercise regularly and eat well. And of course, as Seventh-day Adventists, we observe New Start, so that's a given for us. And N, no going out if you are sick. Stay at home. All right. One of the days I remember there was a gentleman who came to the office and he was coughing on the place, and I'm sorry, but we'd need to ask you to leave. All right, because the mandate is do not go out if you're sick. I'm not concerned whether your cough is attached to the common cold or your cough is attached to you being a smoker. You're coughing. Bye. It's just really simple, and we need to be really strict about it, because at the end of the day, the collective rights are important. We have to ensure that we preserve national security, public health, public order, and morality and the freedoms of others. So what are the takeaways from my presentation as I close? 1. In respect of laws, there is no law or policy that governs the issue of mandatory vaccinations. 2, the collective right to protect public health may justify vaccination in the workplace. As we highlighted earlier, collective rights may trump the individual rights of the person, and the government has a responsibility to perform a balancing act to safeguard both. 3, the trend is to lean towards the mandatory vaccination, but again, must be under the umbrella of, is it reasonable, is it proportionate, and is it a necessary step that has to be taken? 4, termination may not be deemed reasonable, necessary, or proportionate. And 5, the best way that we all can safeguard ourselves, whether an employee, employer, or member of the public, is to maintain and observe the COVID-19 protocols. Let's be wise, let's be safe. May God bless us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee. And again, let me thank Dr. Faith. Thank you, ladies, for spending this afternoon with us. And you are watching our YouTube channel, ASI Media Tobago. And we have been discussing the vaccination dilemma, what work has to do with it. So we are getting right into our questions. Ladies, we have a list of questions for you. Some of it you may have addressed, but our viewers may need some additional clarity. Viewers, we will not be able to answer all the questions as usual, so please forgive us, but we are trying to get them in. So right away, Dr. Faith, questions are listed here for you. It is speculated that the vaccine may suppress our natural immune system, causing it to recognize only COVID, thus compromising our ability to fight off other ailments. Can you clarify that?
Certainly, thank you. So no, that is not how vaccines work, and that is not how the immune system works. If that really were the case, then the vaccines that we took as children would have just allowed our immune system to work against those diseases and no others. And the fact that we've been fighting against all other kinds of diseases, even though we took those childhood vaccines, shows that that's not how the immune system works. So what it does, let me take a second to do this. One of the things it does is, one of the images that I showed earlier included the fact that the virus attaches to the cells by having the spike protein of the virus attached to basically what is known as an ACE receptor on the cells. And what the vaccines do is actually identify the spike protein. So the vaccines look for that specific protein, look for that specific piece of information, so that it prevents, in some instances, that spike protein from attaching to the cell the way it normally would do. That is just one part of how our immune system works, and that does not prevent the immune system from doing other things as it relates to other diseases. So it will not suppress our immune system. It wouldn't.
Okay, and Dr. Faith, I'm going to keep you on for at least 2 more, and then I would bring in Renee with some questions, and we'll continue. If a friend of mine is in quarantine and I was in contact with them, do I also have to go into quarantine too?
Okay, so that's an important question. A person is in quarantine because that person is known as a primary contact to somebody who is positive. So we are talking about 3 different people. So you have the person who is positive. The person in quarantine is somebody who has been in contact with the positive person for at least 15 minutes or a certain amount of days before the person got infected and so forth. There's a specific criteria. So if you have been in contact with the person who is in quarantine, now the person who is in quarantine may not be infected. It's a possibility that they're infected, but they may not be infected. If you are in contact with somebody who is in quarantine, again, it depends on how much contact you have been with that person. If you've just had passing conversations with them, they did not have any symptoms, they are not sick, then there's probably no reason for you to be concerned. You may be classified as a secondary contact though. And as a secondary contact, what is recommended is that you watch your signs, you watch your symptoms, you ensure that you don't, if you start feeling unwell, then you let us know immediately. But if you feel fine, then you should be fine. If your friend though, who is in quarantine, gets tested and is now positive, you may now become a primary contact and you may then be required to go into quarantine. So it's really, it varies. It depends on who is in contact with who and for how long, and it depends on the test results of the person who is actually in quarantine to determine what you need to do.
And this one is...
This is exactly why it's important for you to call, if you have any questions, call that 800-HEAL, because the professionals, they are able to walk you through all of these things to determine where you are and how much risk you have associated with your activities.
Let's repeat that number again for our viewers, Dr. Faye, the 800 numbers.
It's 800-HEAL, and I have no idea what the numbers associated with HEAL, but look for HEAL on your phone tab. I'll find the number. And if you're in Trinidad, the number is 800-WELL. But in Tobago, it's 800-HEAL. I'll look for the number and I'll share it after.
Thank you. And this one is sort of a 2-part question, Dr. Faith. How long does the vaccine last in our system? So the viewer is asking, is it 10 years? And also, what are the long-term effects or impact of taking one of the vaccinations?
Okay, so the reality is we don't know how long the vaccine will work. Um, the the effectiveness of the vaccines are really based on how well our bodies develop the immune response on one hand, but it's also based on how much the virus mutates and how bad the variants come. We have been lucky so far that the variants that are out there, up to the Delta variant, the vaccines that we have seem to still be working, because what the vaccines are looking at, the part of the virus that changes, hasn't changed enough to cause the vaccines to not work. But if we allow the virus to continue replicating in people, to keep getting people sick, to keep going through the process of mutating, then we may get to the point where we have a variant where that these vaccines are not able to work for, and it means we would need to get another vaccine at a later date. But we don't know. What the WHO is doing is really just looking closely. They have scientists in the major countries doing the genetic sequencing of the various viruses that they come about, to see how much they change, and then that would determine, as we collect data, that would determine whether we need to take a booster shot or whether we take a different vaccine later down. And that is why we are telling people it's so important right now to try to halt the spread of it now, because the more we allow it to spread, the more we allow it to mutate, the more we allow it to become a different variant, is the harder the virus would be for us to be able to treat with. I can't remember the second question.
Second question is, what are the long-term effects of vaccines?
We don't, remember, vaccines are things that we've been using for quite some time. I am in my 40s and I was vaccinated for polio and mumps and measles and so forth, and we don't have any long-term effects from those. What people may be concerned about may be some of the short-term side effects that we are seeing immediately, and those are things that we've been able to identify and manage for the most part. But vaccines, the technologies associated with vaccines, are technologies we've been using for decades, and we're not seeing any significant long-term effects that we need to be too concerned about, which is why these vaccines have been able to go through their approval, their clinical trials and approval processes so relatively quickly, because we know about vaccine technologies. We've been using vaccines for decades, and we know how they behave for the most part.
Thank you, Dr. Faith. And let me bring Renee in on some of the questions that we have. And I would come back to you, Dr. Faith. I just want to have, Renee in as well. One of the questions coming in, Renee, what does the law respect more, my human rights or my religious persuasion?
Well, none really trumps the other. All human rights essentially are equal, they are infallible, and they are inherent. And so, really and truly, we can't say that one takes precedence over the other. Because really and truly, your human right, one of your human rights is your right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So you do have the right to attach yourself to any religious organization and to hold or to denounce religious beliefs. So I cannot really say, Sister Nat, that at the end of the day, one trumps the other. What the government would have to do, what the state has to do, is recognize all. And where a restriction has to be imposed, they will need to consider to what degree are we upholding one right and infringing upon another. But it doesn't necessarily mean that in doing so, they denounce or they're seeking to, in any way, not recognize one of your rights. It is just that because of the prevailing circumstances, there is the need, it is proportionate, and it is reasonable at one point in time to impose a fetter.
If they are saying that there is no mandatory law for the vaccine, why are many workplaces making it mandatory to maintain your job?
Well, as I mentioned before, employers have a duty to provide a safe system of work. It's a duty of care that they have towards their employees. And so there are some employers in seeking to uphold this duty, this obligation rather, they are imposing this requirement for the mandatory vaccination. Remember, as I said, the employer is somewhat liable if he does and liable if he doesn't, because there's no law that requires it. And so essentially, he is doing it based on his understanding of what is required of him for providing a safe environment for his employees and for the public to interact with his establishment. However, by doing so, or by seeking to threaten an employee but losing their job if they fail to take the vaccine, I think there is where the employer may be overstepping what is permissible to them within the body of legislation that we have present now. And so that may also expose rather the employer to a breach of industrial law and cause him to find himself being sued before the industrial court. So at the end of the day, there is no law, but they do have an obligation to provide a safe system of work and a safe environment of work to ensure that the employees are functioning within a healthy work environment. So I think that many of them are doing it with that in mind, not necessarily understanding that that itself exposes them to some sort of liability.
Right, and I have another one, it's related. If an employer asks his unvaccinated employees to come to work with a negative PCR test weekly, is that unreasonable? The employer has politely asked employees to consider it since they are involved in the service industry.
I don't think it is unreasonable. I think it may be disproportionate. Weekly, we know that the PCR test has a certain lifespan. And Dr. Faith might be better able to comment on that. So I'm thinking that to ask or to have the employees undergo the PCR test, it's very uncomfortable. Weekly may be disproportionate to the objective that is being sought to achieve. However, if the employer decides, well, listen, I just want you all to consider taking a PCR test so that we can be sure, he wants to have peace of mind that his employees are in fact negative, I think that is one of the alternatives that an employer could reasonably consider.
Thank you. And let me bring Dr. Faith in and do that follow-up question right away before we continue. Let's look at the PCR test. What is it, and do you think it's unreasonable, Dr. Faith, for an employer to ask for employees to take the PCR weekly?
So it's not, the PCR test is a test that basically tests for the genetic material of viral particles. So it's not just used for COVID-19, it's actually used for HIV, for any kind of test where you need to determine exactly what virus we're dealing with. There are actually cheaper ways of doing testing for COVID-19 that are not, of course, there's the trade-off. If you have a cheaper option, it's not necessarily the most, it doesn't give you the most accurate responses. So if you are looking at a weekly test, you may choose to do an antigen test or another type of test instead of a PCR test. If you look at, I think it's Antigua and Barbuda, if I'm not mistaken, they just came out with a vaccination policy. I have to check to see which country is it, if it's Antigua and Barbuda. But they just came out with a vaccination policy that says if you choose not to be vaccinated, you do have to provide a negative PCR test every 2 weeks to continue working if you are in the public service, if you're in the essential services. I have to put it up to see which country it is, but that was a notice that came out within the last couple of days from one of our Caribbean brothers and sisters. So it is not it's not foreign. It's not something that we've not heard of. But the weeks period, because to do the PCR, it's a nasal pharyngeal test, so they have to practically stick something all the way up to in your nose. It's a very uncomfortable test. I don't know that anyone would want to take it every week. I don't know that it's necessary to do it every week, but I have seen where they are requesting it at least every 2 weeks from other areas in other jurisdictions.
And Dr. Faith, why do we still have to wear masks and practice social distancing after being vaccinated? And this viewer is also looking at what's happening in the US, where it's optional. These practices are optional after vaccination.
So the difference between Trinidad and Tobago and the US is the percentage of the population that is already vaccinated. And by the way, there is no set standard mask policy for the United States. Each state makes its own rules based on what is important or where their numbers are. In Trinidad and Tobago, our vaccination rates are still very, very low. If you look at the numbers that you recorded today, of the 60,000 of us in Tobago, only about 10,000 of us are fully vaccinated, which means that you have at least 80-90% of the population that is unvaccinated, which means that we are not in a position at all to even think about not using the mask or not using any of the other provisions, because we simply don't have enough people who are not vaccinated to protect those who are vaccinated. And by the way, that is the definition of herd immunity, which is where you have a large enough proportion of the population vaccinated for any disease, whether it's COVID or not. And because you have a large proportion of people vaccinated, and because they are protected the way the vaccines work, then they actually are able to protect those who are unvaccinated. But the proportion has to be one where it is at least 70-80% of the population vaccinated can then help protect those who are unvaccinated. It's also important to note in the United States that the states where they are seeing the highest daily rates of COVID-19 positive infections, highest daily rates of death, highest daily rates of hospitalizations are actually the states where they have started removing some of the mask mandates. And it's the same states where they are not vaccinating people as much as they should. So if you look at the reports for Florida, for example, Florida is now surpassing all of the other states, even California, a state that is so much larger than Florida, because Florida has very low vaccination rates. And Florida is one of those states with with no mask mandate. So the virus is just running rampant in Florida again, even today compared to a couple weeks ago. Again, because of how difficult this Delta variant is to manage and how easy it is to transmit this Delta variant. So it's a problem that we need to be concerned about and not be too quick to remove the mask mandates, particularly if we don't have a large enough proportion of the population that's vaccinated.
Thank you. And if the vaccine is introduced to the body for your body to create antibodies to fight the virus, would it be necessary to be vaccinated or get the vaccine if your body naturally created antibodies and eliminated the virus entirely?
What you're talking about is getting natural immunity versus a passive immunity versus active immunity. Natural immunity is what you get if you are one of those people who got COVID-19 and you were blessed enough to have survived. The thing about getting natural immunity, though, is that the level of immunity that each person gets really, really varies. And the part of the virus that each person immune response looks at and creates antibodies against may actually change. And in some instances, we are realizing that there are people who are getting natural immunity, but they are not necessarily getting natural immunity to the spike protein, which is a critical part of the virus that has not been changing as much as the other parts of the virus has been changing. So yes, if you got COVID-19 and bless your heart, you survived it, you do have some level of natural immunity, but we are saying that that is actually not as protective as it should have been. And there are actually cases now where individuals are saying that people who survived the initial variations of COVID-19, as in the before we started getting the different variants. They are actually getting reinfected now with the variants because their bodies simply did not create antibodies against the way these new variants are. So you're not as protected. So it's a risk that you should not necessarily take right now, particularly with this Delta variant running around.
And before I bring Renee back, this question again, Dr. Faith, and the viewer says, I heard you mentioned SARS/COVID as the type of virus that is responsible for the virus COVID-19. However, there are so many discussions worldwide about the different variants of COVID. If the virus is SARS/COVID and the immune system is programmed to respond to that particular virus, what happens when the different variants enter the body?
Okay, so that's a good question. It sounds almost like a biology question. So what the immune system is responding to, or what the vaccines are causing your immune system to respond to, is a special protein on the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That's known as the spike protein. That is a protein that connects it to the cells, that connects to the ACE receptors of the cells. The fact that there are variants does not mean that we have a completely different virus. It is just a variant of the SARS-CoV-2. So the immune response is still to the SARS-CoV-2. We have not gotten to the point as yet where the variants are so very different that they would be classified as a different kind of virus. Right now, we are still dealing with the same virus. It's just changing and tweaking slightly differently and causing it to have different properties. So it's important to recognize that it's not a different virus that we are getting the immunity from when we do the vaccines. It's the same virus. It's just that that virus is being tweaked a little bit as it perpetuates, as it multiplies throughout the communities. And that's the problem.
Thank you. And let's move to Renee. Renee, can employers use the Health and Safety Act to implement
Oh, no, I was just saying I just got confirmation that it's St. Vincent and the Grenadines where that policy is to have the negative PCR test every couple of weeks to continue working if you don't want to get vaccinated. Sorry for cutting you off.
for updating us? Can employers use the Health and Safety Act to implement vaccination as mandatory in the private sector?
Well, let me just say that the health and safety legislation that we have in Trinidad and Tobago is a derivative of our international covenants. So generally what happens when a government accedes or ratifies an international covenant, they now have a responsibility to return to their jurisdictions and introduce pieces of legislation that give effect to their international obligation. So our health and safety legislation is one piece of legislation that was introduced for that purpose, to ensure that we preserve the economic, social, and cultural rights of our citizens. That being said, the health and safety legislation does not speak to a mandatory vaccination. Obviously, it was introduced in a period of time where COVID did not exist. And so, ultimately, what employers have an obligation to do is to provide a safe system of work, to provide a safe and healthy work environment. Therefore, what your response or your meeting of that objective, again, must not exceed what is required. Where the government has not mandated the taking of the vaccination for its own employees, generally, to operate within the state entities, a private employer is cautioned against taking such an approach and seeking to manipulate legislation to extend or buttress that mandate rather, that somebody should take the vaccine. The reality is that the government, with the legislation is clear, imposed by law. So you recognize that upon the entrance of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government would have introduced regulations to treat with it, to respond to it. And the restrictions would have been introduced incrementally as the need arose for us to respond to what were the prevailing circumstances at the time. So there were times when we were completely within lockdown, and then there were times that they opened back certain sectors, etc., as the case may be, as the numbers lowered or reduced. So I do not therefore see how, if the government is taking this approach to returning to normalcy, that an employer could seek to utilize the Health and Safety Act to impose mandatory vaccination in the absence of a specific law expressing same. So I generally don't think that would be permissible, and I would caution any employer from seeking to do so.
And can an employer be liable if he or she mandates an employee to be vaccinated and that employee now becomes sick or even dies as a result of the vaccination?
That's a loaded question, because the reality is, that's why I highlighted what the Patient's Charter of Rights and Responsibility says. So if it is that the employer, let me say the doctrine of negligence, I'll have to touch on the doctrine of negligence there, because there is a duty of care owed by the employer. All right. Now, for an employer to have liability, it must be established that they breached the duty of care to the employee. And by breaching the duty of care to the employee suffered harm. I don't necessarily see that cause and effect happening if an employer mandates the vaccination. The employee makes the choice, because it's still the employee's choice, whether to submit themselves to the vaccination or not. And then thereafter claim that, well, my employer mandated I take the vaccine, so my employer is now liable for whatever risk. In fact, that may more be to the vaccine provider, because I saw somebody was asking, how is it that the vaccine provider has no risk? And there is, in fact, a risk. It is just that you have to establish that whatever harm you suffered was directly attributable or caused by the vaccine. And so I don't necessarily see, I think I don't want to use like legal jargon too much, but it's remote. It's a bit remote for you to claim that because my employer mandated I take the vaccine, you made the informed choice to do so and thereafter suffered some consequences that you can claim against the employer. Let me say this though. I am speaking right now in a vacuum, because within our jurisdiction, we do not have a plethora of case law or precedent to refer to. So it does not mean that a person may not be able to claim against an employer for that. And the court, of course, the courts are deemed the interpreters of legislation. So they are the ones who will really make that determination based on the argument submitted for that. But right now, we don't really have that degree of case law that would really give buttress to this position that the employee is seeking to argue that because my employer mandated I take the vaccine, it resulted in me suffering some harm. The courts may say differently, and we will only know that when a case of this nature actually comes before them. But right now, I would think with respect to causation, it's a bit too remote to argue that, particularly where the employee would have made the choice to submit to the vaccine.
Thank you so much, Rennie. It was really a pleasure having you educate us and present information to us. And I know that our viewers are also appreciative. And that's all the questions I have for you, Rennie, this afternoon. Well, we are into evening now, so we spend afternoon to evening with each other. And we just really want to say thank you from the ASI team for joining us.
Very much for having me. God bless you all.
Dr. Faith, I have about 2 more questions. At least that's all the time we have right now. You mentioned herd immunity, and a viewer is asking, what percentage of persons need to be vaccinated in order for our country to arrive at herd immunity?
Okay, so herd immunity varies based on the kind of virus that you're dealing with and the kind of transmission rates seen with the virus. Initially, when we were talking about the original versions of the SARS-CoV-2, we were looking at 60-65% of the population being vaccinated to be classified as having herd immunity. With this Delta variant now, it seems like that would have to go up a chunk. I am estimating, and this is just me estimating. I haven't pulled this from any literature, but I am looking at us getting to at least 80%, even higher than that, for us to be really protected against this Delta variant that is running amok in the rest of the world right now to actually achieve herd immunity.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just looking for that one more question that came in. Oh, someone is asking, and this is if you can answer, of course, what vaccine would you recommend for someone who has an autoimmune disease?
For somebody who has an that is a situation where you would have to, I would recommend you actually talking to your doctor, because an autoimmune disease is one where your body sees itself as foreign or sees different aspects of itself as foreign and is therefore attacking itself. I am not sure. I don't have any information about how individuals with autoimmune diseases, how they interact with the vaccines that we have now. That is something that I would not want to advise on, because I really haven't done the research as it relates to autoimmune diseases at all. But to answer the question generally, if you have any of the other, in particular, any of the other comorbidities that are very common in Trinidad and Tobago, and we're talking about diseases like diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, different kinds of cancers and so forth, then your body is already working really, really hard to survive normally. It means that if you come into contact with COVID-19, your body is going to have a kind of a hard time fighting it off, and particularly this Delta variant. So whatever vaccine is available is the vaccine that you should go and get, particularly if you have one of these other comorbidities.
This is the last question for you, Dr. Faith. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for spending time, for presenting information so that we can all, have access to information to make whatever choice we need to make. And this question, any research data where botanics or herbal remedies can be effective against the COVID-19 virus?
But I also know that there's a chunk of people who have been taking what we normally call our bush medicine and so forth, and it's been working. Remember, the situation is that a large proportion of the people who get COVID-19 are going to have very mild symptoms, probably moderate symptoms. Some would even have no symptoms or very little symptoms, so they are not even sure that they actually had COVID because the symptoms were so mild. I personally believe that Trinidad and Tobago, and particularly Tobago, has actually been getting a breaks from COVID because so many of us are taking our natural remedies, our herbal remedies. We've been doing the things that were passed down through generations. Our grandparents and great grandparents taught us to go and pick this bush and drink it and that kind of thing. And I think that has been helping. What we don't have, though, is actual research to show that that is what is helping. And unfortunately, we would have loved to have a University of Tobago, for example, that is studying exactly that right now. But we don't have that data, and I have not seen that data from other jurisdictions. But it's not. It's not. In my mind, personally, I think it is helping. I just don't have any data to prove that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Faith. Thank you again, Renee, ladies, for spending the afternoon into evening with us here. And, I am sure we can call on you again if we need to. And for viewers, I must say thank you as well, our Facebook viewers, our YouTube viewers, for staying with us and for always choosing ASI Media Tobago to be a part of your routine. Remember, we continue our services tomorrow at 6 p.m. We have our ASI Kitchen on Tuesday. We meet for prayer Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. And of course, your Friday afternoon family worship and our Friday evening talks. And we go right back to Sabbath. So we're keeping everyone busy and just encouraging us all to continue praising God. And remember to be the child or be the children we should be so that when he comes again, we can all be saved. I am Natalie C.D. Richardson saying thank you. And at this time, we get ready for a closing prayer that will be done by Brother Damian Edwards.
Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to know that we really stayed. I have been following the YouTube channel and the Facebook pages, and indeed it was well received. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to just leave us with a passage of scripture and also a statement from patriarchs, prophets and kings, before I pray. The Bible says in Psalms 25, verse 8 and 9, the Bible says, "Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore will he teach sinners in the way. The meek will he guide in judgment, and the meek will he teach his ways." In Prophets and Kings, it says, "The meek are guided by the Lord because they are teachable, willing to be instructed. They have a sincere desire to know and to do the will of God. But his promises is only to those who are willing to follow the Lord wholly. God does not force the will of any. Hence, he cannot lead those who are too proud to be taught, who are bent upon having their own way." And so with this said, let's bow for prayer. Heavenly Father, dear God, this evening, this afternoon, we are truly thankful for the processes and the discussion. Heavenly Father, individuals have been passionate. We know our people here in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider world, we express our opinion. But, oh God, we pray that your will be done in our lives. And Heavenly Father, let us continue to seek you. Let us continue to seek your promises that are going to direct us and guide us through our daily living. Let your will be done. Let your power continue to be felt. And Heavenly Father, when all is said and done, let us continue to praise thee. Let us continue to live the life that is going to reflect a relationship that we have with thee. Be with us. Grant us a great new week that have already started because the sun has set, and so we have started a new work week. Let your will be done. Let your power continue first, and continue to bless our viewership, dear Lord. Continue to be with everybody, mummies and daddies, aunties and uncles, grandmothers and grandfathers, boys and girls. Let your power continue to be felt in our lives. These are the mercies we ask with thanksgiving. In Jesus' precious name, amen.